in a moment. And uh, one of the characters in the novel Demons is inspired by the figure of Turgenev. So Turgenev was, in today's terms, you would call a frenemy of Dostoevsky. They knew each other very well and had a very loaded and difficult relationship. And of course, Tolstoy. I love this photograph because you see the editorial board of the Russian journal The Contemporary, Современник, which was founded by Pushkin. And here you see, I hope you can see my cursor, here's Tolstoy in his military uniform just after his service at the Crimean War. And here we have Turgenev, who was 10 years older than Tolstoy. So Turgenev and Tolstoy served together on the editorial board of The Contemporary. Of course, and here's another photograph of Tolstoy looking young and dashing in his military uniform. Tolstoy and Dostoevsky never met. They published in the same magazine. They revolved in the same circles. They never met, which is one of those marvelous mysteries of history. The magazine, what they published, is Русский Вестник, the Russian Messenger. And the editor of the Russian Messenger was someone who knew how to collect genius. It's fascinating that in 1866, when Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment was serialized in the Russian Messenger, simultaneously, War and Peace was serialized in the same magazine. So you can just imagine being Russian readers in 1866, receiving a next installment of both War and Peace and Crime and Punishment in the same literary magazine, which is remarkable. Who else were Dostoevsky's contemporaries? The painter Repin and his amazing painting of Ivan the Terrible, Ivan Grozny, was his son. Kramskoy, wonderful painting that often ends up on the cover of Anna Karenina. Vasnetsov, the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, which becomes a very important theme in Dostoevsky's novel The Idiot. Ayvazovsky, wonderful seascape painter. Who else were Dostoevsky's contemporaries? In music, it was Mikhail Glinka, of course, wonderful opera, Ruslan and Ludmila. Mussorgsky, wonderful opera, once again, based on Pushkin. Boris Godunov, wonderful composer and chemistry professor, Baradin. And of course, last but not least, sorry, I'm going the wrong way, Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky, who was a universal genius who wrote wonderfully in every genre. So Dostoevsky is living in this incredible moment in Russian history where in the aftermath of the War of 1812, in the aftermath of the Napoleonic invasion, Russian culture comes into maturity, comes into its own. It's the golden age of the Russian novel, and Russian music and Russian art are world-class, and the recognition is definitely there. Russia is also quite enormous at the time when Notes from Underground is published in 1864. Russia still has Alaska at this point. It will not be sold to the United States till after the US Civil War. And so it's fascinating that in Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky actually takes a jab at the United States, he says, and that everlasting union. Of course, he was writing Notes from Underground during the US Civil War, which was an attempt to preserve the Union, very bloody attempt. And so this enormous country produced this incredible talent, and Dostoevsky was definitely a part of an incredible stretch of accomplishments. We always associate Dostoevsky with St. Petersburg, and here's this amazing painting of the statue of Peter the Great. The bronze horseman was the Isaac Cathedral in the background. But Dostoevsky was not born in St. Petersburg. He was some of his greatest novels, including Notes from Underground, but most importantly, Crime and Punishment and The Idiot, are set in St. Petersburg. But he was a Muscovite by birth, so absolutely, absolutely amazing. He was born in a hospital in Moscow, and it was quite unusual to be born in hospitals at the time when he was born in 1821. His father was a doctor, and so that explains his hospital birth, but also it's a very modern way to be born into this world. Most of us have been born in hospitals, but before the 19th century, most people were born at home. So it definitely heralds Dostoevsky's advent as a harbinger of modernity. The fact that he saw this world for the first time in the hospital, and there's a wonderful statue to Dostoevsky in front of the hospital. One of the wings of the hospital contains the Dostoevsky Museum, which is delightful to visit. His father was, of course, a medical doctor, and his mother was a delightful storyteller. So Dostoevsky family loved to read long books, as families did in the 19th century. And his mother introduced him to fairy tales, and he became a very good storyteller. That's how he ended up writing his Great Five, especially starting with The Gambler and novels such as The Idiot. Um, After that, Demons, The Adolescent, and Brothers Karamazov were all performed and dictated to his wife, Anna Grigorievna. Pushkin died the same year as Dostoevsky's mother, and Dostoevsky said that he was mourning for both. It was a great loss for him to be orphaned as a teenager. His mother died when he was 16, but losing Pushkin the same year made the loss doubly heavy for Dostoevsky. Gogol was a first great inspiration. Dostoevsky absolutely loved Gogol's tale, The Overcoat, and in so many ways, the beginning of his writing was inspired by Gogol. Dostoevsky studied at the Mikhailovsky Castle building of St. Petersburg University. He was a military engineering student. And I always joke and tell my students that this is how universities acquire attractive buildings. Emperor Paul was so worried about being assassinated that he built a castle for himself, the Mikhailovsky Castle, and of course it was in that castle that he was assassinated. So the Romanov family handed the building over to the university, and that is where Dostoevsky spent his student days. I love this photograph of the Mikhailovsky Castle. You can see it here, and this long stretch of green between the Mikhailovsky Castle and the Neva River is Letny Sad, the summer gardens, where Dostoevsky loved to spend so much of his time. And of course, that is the place where Pushkin spent so much of his time. So wonderful connection there. And Dostoevsky becomes this dreamer that he creates in some of his first works. A young man who is in love with St. Petersburg, in love with white nights, Белые ночи, and in love with life, and in love with dreaming about life. His second composition was actually White Nights, Белые ночи, and it talks about a dreamer. The young man is never named, just like the underground man in Notes from Underground is never named, and a young woman whose name is Nastinka. And that name, Nastinka, will be resurrected by Dostoevsky later on in his novel, The Idiot, in the name of Nastasia Filipovna. And here's another wonderful illustration. Here's our dreamer huddled up, walking towards Anichkov Most. And this lost and solitary figure who is crushed by the enormity of the great metropolis of St. Petersburg will be the figure that we will see in Notes from Underground in our Underground Men. There's a wonderful film adaptation of Notes from Underground by Visconti. You can see here Jean Marais and Maria Schell as two of the characters in Dostoevsky's White Nights. I strongly recommend seeing this movie. It's set in post-World War II Italy, but of course inspired by White Nights. And of course, Dostoevsky's first publication was Poor Folk, Бедные люди. This is the book where one of the characters is a huge admirer of Pushkin, and Pushkin's works are definitely referenced in this novella of Dostoevsky. Poor folk, Бедные люди, is inspired by Karamzin's title, and Karamzin's Бедная Лиза, Poor Lisa, is a literary work that was reverberating throughout the 19th century in many compositions. That name Lisa will then resurface in Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. The Double becomes the novel that breaks Dostoevsky's ascent towards literary glory. His Poor Folk was heralded by Nekrasov, who was then the editor of The Contemporary, as a great continuation of the tradition of Gogol. But critics did not like The Double. The Double was a novel that was incredibly complicated. And it's fascinating how, yes, Dostoevsky will continue writing about the urban underclass in many of his compositions, especially in Crime and Punishment. But it is the doubling of the human personality that he will focus on in all of his works. And so when you look at a novel like The Idiot, you see the doubling of Rogozhin and Mishkin. When you look at at Demons, you see the doubling of Stavrogin and Verkhovensky. Crime and Punishment, you see the doubling of Raskolnikov and Svidrigailov. So these doubles of human personalities will continue resurfacing in all of his works. So this is an incredibly important novel of early Dostoevsky. And I can't recommend this film adaptation enough. It's called The Double, and it's with Jesse Eisenberg. Sort of a combination of Dostoevsky's Double and 1984. It's set in a very dystopian world where characters are lost in their own perception and in a world where they're completely not needed and discardable. Wonderful, wonderful film adaptation. I remember when this film was first released on DVD, I immediately brought it to the classroom and I said to my students, we're not discussing what we were supposed to discuss today. We're watching this adaptation because it's brilliant. Dostoevsky starts associating with socialist students, with radical reading groups. He joins this group called the Petrashevsky Circle, and they meet in this building in St. Petersburg. It's called Dom Shilya, Shil's house. The plaque is still on the building today. And they read the works of French utopian socialists such as Henri Saint-Simon and Fourier. And they read something else. So this is, of course, Vissarion Belinsky, the Russian critic. Turgenev's Fathers and Sons is dedicated to him. In so many ways, Turgenev's Bazarov is based on Belinsky. And one of the things that this Petrashevsky group reads is Belinsky's letter to who else? Dostoevsky's great, in Russian, the word is kumir, great object of admiration, Gogol. Gogol becomes quite conservative at the end of his life. He supports the Tsar. He supports, in Russian it's called Samodержавие. He supports even the institution of serfdom. And Belinsky, who was a great social critic, writes a letter to Gogol expressing his disappointment with his views. The letter was banned by the censors because it's so incredibly critical of Russian governing structures. And so this letter to Belinsky is read by the students in the Petrashevsky Circle. Of course, in the aftermath of the revolution of 1848, such revolutionary activity was very dangerous, and the entirety of the group is arrested after the reading of Belinsky's letter to Gogol. And they are sent to this beautiful building, which looks so lovely today. It's the Peter and Paul Fortress, Petropavlovskaya Krepость in St. Petersburg. But of course, it is a military prison. Dostoevsky and all of the Petrashevskys are sent into this prison. They're kept there for several months, and then they are handed the death sentence. And so Dostoevsky is the only writer I teach who has been sentenced to death. They are marched onto the Semyonovsky plots, and the execution is supposed to proceed. It's death by firing squad, and the shot does not come, and does not come, and does not come. Nicholas I had a flair for the dramatic. He he decided to delay the fact that he was commuting their sentence to exile to Siberia. And so the execution never took place. Finally, the message from the Tsar was delivered with a slight delay to just let the horror of the situation sink in. And the young men were informed that they've been pardoned by the Tsar, and their punishment is exile to Siberia to do hard labor. This is the experience that Dostoevsky will describe at the beginning of his novel, The Idiot, when Prince Myshkin is going to enter the Yapanchin home, and he will talk about the thoughts of a human being on the verge of realizing that you are about to lose your life. And so it's a painting of the road that Russian convicts took to Siberia. It's called Vladimirka, and it's a painting by Isaac Levitan, great friend of Chekhov. Dostoevsky takes this road to this region of Russia. He ends up being stationed near Omsk, and he lives in the barracks for 4 years as a political prisoner. But he is there together with robbers, murderers, and he will describe this experience in his writer's diaries, but also in his book, Notes from the Dead House. The only book that he will be able to read, the only book that convicts can read in Siberia during hard labor service would be the New Testament. And it's fascinating that Dostoevsky's copy of New Testament, this is my photograph from his archives, was given to him by a Decembrist wife. So Decembrists were exiled to Siberia in 1826, and their wives, several of their wives followed them. They greeted the new incoming political prisoners to Omsk region, and they gave them the only book that was allowed in the labor camps, which would be the New Testament, with some money sewn into the cover. Dostoevsky will keep this New Testament for the rest of his life. There are scenes in Crime and Punishment where Raskolnikov and Sonia Marmeladova read from the New Testament, and the description of the book is the physical description of the book that Dostoevsky received from the Decembrist wives. He will keep it to the end of his life. It will be on his nightstand when he will die in St. Petersburg in 1881. Dostoevsky, in addition to doing this just grueling and inhuman, completely isolating 4-year period in a Russian prison camp near Omsk, Dostoevsky also discovered wide open spaces. The journey from the cramped environment of urbanity into the wilderness of nature was actually transformative for Dostoevsky. And he will write about this experience at the very end of Crime and Punishment. And then after his sentence was once again commuted, he was allowed to leave the prison camp, and he became a prison guard at another Russian labor camp, this one near the town of Semipalatinsk in what is today Kazakhstan, and the city is called Semey today. There's a statue in Omsk to Dostoevsky, and I absolutely love the statue. The section of the New Testament that Sonia Marmeladova and Rodion Raskolnikov read in Crime and Punishment is the story of Lazarus. And I love the statue of Dostoevsky because he is walking off the pedestal into the eternity of his glory while shedding the bonds that bind him. This freedom of the mind during the confinement of the body is something that Dostoevsky will write about in every one of his novels after his release from hard labor. And of course, the end result of all of that suffering was the book Zapiski из мертвого дома, Notes from the Dead House. And it's the first book that he will write that will contain notes in it, Zapiski. And of course, Notes from Underground is in that series of books. Notes from the Dead House actually has been turned into an opera, which is the most unlikely of Dostoevsky novels to become an opera. Turned into an opera by Leos Janacek from the House of the Dead, and actually went to see a production of this Leos Janacek opera at the Metropolitan Opera a few years ago. It was staggeringly complex, depressing, and uplifting at the same time. production of this fictionalized account of Dostoevsky's life in a Siberian prison camp. And so here we have it. Dostoevsky is 10 years older, much wiser, broken, and yet uplifted. The early compositions of his life were Poor Folk, White Knights, and The Double. He's allowed to come back to the European side of Russia. He's married at this point. His wife is Maria Isayeva, a widow with a young boy. Dostoevsky will care for that boy for the rest of his life. Maria Isayeva will die while Dostoevsky is writing Notes from Underground. So much of that pain and suffering will definitely be reflected in his writing. Dostoevsky also, Dostoevsky is allowed to come back to Moscow and St. Petersburg, and he's trying to reestablish his writing contacts. He's trying to reestablish his publishing contacts, but it's very hard to do this after you have been a Siberian convict. None of these books, except for The Double right here, have been published yet. Definitely 20 more years till the publication of Brothers Karamazov. So this is the beginning of the mature Dostoevsky, who will produce these incredible, incredible novels. He's allowed to travel abroad, which is really surprising. He goes to Germany, England, and France. And of course, there's still no Germany to speak of at this point. And it's not going to be unified till 1870. But Dostoevsky encounters a young revolutionary woman during this trip. Her name is Apollinaria Suslova. She will eventually become the character of Polina in his novel, The Gambler, Igrok. And she will become the model for all of the femme fatale female characters in his works. And this is where we come to the inspiration for Notes from Underground. In Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky talks a great deal about the Crystal Palace and how he's being very sarcastic about this Crystal Palace. He says, well, Crystal Palace is a great place, beautiful. But if it starts raining, are you going to look for a Crystal Palace, or are you going to hide yourself in a chicken coop? And a chicken coop will do very nicely if the purpose of your life is not to get wet. So Dostoevsky sees this marvel of marvels, this marvel of engineering, built in 1851 in London for the World's Exhibition, supervised by Prince Albert, and the architect is Joseph Paxton. It's made of glass. It's the marvel of modern engineering. If you look at it, it looks like a train station or mall. If you keep making it taller, it looks like a skyscraper. It's the advent of modernity in architecture. And Dostoevsky does not think much of it. He's a little worried about this new construction. This is what it looks like on the inside, and you can see Queen Victoria at the opening of this marvel. And Dostoevsky remembers seeing this building, and he's a little disquieted by the horror of life that he sees on the streets of London and on the streets of Paris. Child prostitution, alcoholism, the complete alienation of the working class from the cultural elites. And he is attempting to bring all of this together in a composition that he will be writing for a magazine that his brother Mikhail will start for Dostoevsky. So publishing is very hard for Dostoevsky after Siberia, and his brother Mikhail will start 2 magazines for him. So Notes from the Dead House, The Insulted and the Injured, will be published in his magazine Epoch, and then Notes from Underground will be published in the magazine Время. So Notes from Underground is an 1864 book. So of course it was published after the abolition of serfdom in 1861. Turgenev's Fathers and Sons was hugely inspirational for Dostoevsky. And Fathers and Sons, it's sort of the foundational novel for all of Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky will correspond, will have a conversation with Turgenev's Fathers and Sons and his character of Bazarov in all of his great works after Notes from Underground. Chernyshevsky has his own response to Fathers and Sons, and that's the novel What Is to Be Done. Lenin at one point commented that this is the book that turned him into a confirmed revolutionary, someone who was committed to the revolutionary movement more so than any other book. Chernyshevsky, as all the progressive critics and progressive readers, read Fathers and Sons and were disappointed that the character of Bazarov was not allowed to self-realize as a committed revolutionary. Thus, in What's to be Done, What is to be done, Что делать, Chernyshevsky will create characters who are much more self-conscious about giving up on the personal in order to serve the communal revolutionary goal. Dostoevsky will read both, and Notes from Underground will be his response to both Turgenev and to Chernyshevsky. Notes from Underground is one of those books that will attack the Crystal Palace over and over and over again, and that's what I discussed with my students yesterday. Why is this obsessive need to attack this beautiful building? And what Dostoevsky saw in this building is yet another representation of human hubris. Look at us. We are so culturally sophisticated. Our rational thinking brought us to this incredible realization of all of our dreams and aspirations. It's this palace made of glass. It's made of crystal. And it is so incredibly gorgeous that it's making us more than proud of ourselves and bringing us to the point of considering it to be our very own Tower of Babel. Dostoevsky loved to talk and write about the Tower of Babel because he felt that it was one of those foundational moments for the development of humanity. Human beings who were so filled with their own self-importance, so filled with their own hubris, that they decided to build a tower that would help them reach the heavens. To be closer to God? No. To grab God and bring him down to their level. And this becomes the core idea of Dostoevsky's novels after Notes from Underground. Maria Isayeva sadly dies while he's writing this novel, and he keeps writing to his brother Mikhail saying, "Be my benefactor, please. Let me have another month. If I can just keep writing, you will have a much, much better work." The pain and suffering of Dostoevsky in this novel is palpable. Let me just see what image I have after this. So now I would like to just focus maybe for 5 more minutes on Notes from Underground itself, and then perhaps address some of the questions that you have and talk about film interpretations of Notes from Underground. So the book is 160 years old this year. I'm going to teach it on Substack starting on September 1. I will offer extensive commentary on the novel, so please join if you are so inclined, and if you want to do a guided reading with hundreds of other readers who will be enjoying it. At this point, I'm commenting on Eugene Onegin on Substack. And later in April, I will comment on Hero of Our Time and Fathers and Sons in May. And this is our preparation for getting into Notes from Underground in September. What to think of this book? It starts with a character who is screaming out of the underground of his own soul and saying that he is a sick man, he is a lonely man, he is ill, but he will not see doctors. He's talking about how devastating it is for us to have conscience, that conscience is the source of all of our suffering. But at the same time, he says he completely understands that people will never abandon conscience because perhaps suffering is more profitable for us than well-being. And in Notes from Underground, he has this immortal statement, making people happy against their will, making people forcefully happy is a terrible disservice to humanity. And Dostoevsky says, give a human being such economic precondition that this human being will only sleep, eat gingerbread, and worry about the non-cessation of world history. And it is here, precisely here, that this human being, out of sheer ingratitude, out of sheer lampoonery, will do something nasty. Of course, gingerbread in Russian is prяники, but I gave my students, I find it very amusing that there's this gingerbread thing called Anna's Swedish Ginger Thins. Since my name is Anna, that's what I shared with my students. So there we were in our classroom. We were eating gingerbread. We were half asleep. It was a late class. worried about the non-cessation of world history, and realizing that deep down in our core inner being, we are a bundle of contradictions, and this contradictory state of humanity where we're young, we're healthy, we should be content with life, and yet there's this rage inside, a rage that cannot be addressed rationally. And Dostoevsky, at the end of Notes from Underground, states humanity is just full of contradictions, and we want to have a blueprint for how we are going to react to life. We seem to drown ourselves in narratives, because without narratives, we cannot think straight about our own existence. And Dostoevsky is worried at the end of Notes from Underground that pretty soon we will not be able to exist without creating some kind of blueprint for ourselves that comes from a book. The underground man is a reader. He, in so many ways, he reads himself into the underground, and now he is writing himself out of the underground. And his notes, Zapiski, is this tribute to his desire to come to terms what it means to be human. And that will become the main theme of all of Dostoevsky's novels. It's not accidental that I put Crime and Punishment as my next slide, because Crime and Punishment is an extended meditation based on Notes from Underground. So I see a question here. Going off of this, do you think that your students, there was a previous question, sorry, I will just go back. So many questions. Best place. So do you think that Notes from Underground is the best place to start with Dostoevsky? The other possible ways of introducing young people to this, yes, White Knights earlier. So what I tell my students, if you, let me backtrack. Students sometimes tell me, Anna, I know that you are reading like Brothers Karamazov and Crime and Punishment and War and Peace and Anna Karenina in one class. It's called Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. I don't have time to do this. If I can just read one Tolstoy novel, what would it be? I always tell students, just read War and Peace. It's fantastic. You will love it. It's amazing. In my other classes, I teach Hadjimurad, I teach the Cossacks, I teach Sevastopol sketches, and many other works of Tolstoy. And then they say, with Dostoevsky, should I just read Brothers Karamazov? And I say, no, you can't do that. With Dostoevsky, it's a wonderful progression. Yes, from Poor Folk, from White Knights, from The Double, all the way to Brothers Karamazov. But if you are going to read the Great Five, and the Great Five are Crime and Punishment, Idiot, Demons, The Adolescent, and Brothers Karamazov, you have to read Notes from Underground. So I teach 3 University of Iowa classes in the Russian program. And in every single one of them, we read Notes from Underground, because to understand Dostoevsky, post-Siberia Dostoevsky, the Dostoevsky who is so revelatory in the Great Five, you have to read Notes from Underground. It's also essential to read Fathers and Sons before reading Notes from Underground, because you have to understand the dialogue that Dostoevsky will engage in with Turgenev for the rest of his for the rest of his writing. Let's see. I will go back to the first question. Do you think that Notes from the Underground is the best place? That was it. Okay, we addressed this. Do you think that Notes from Underground is the best? Okay. It was posted twice. Sorry, I apologize for that. Morally ambiguous protagonists have become increasingly popular in 21st century film and TV. Do you think that Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground or Underground Man paved the way to this type of character? Or was there precedent for, oh my goodness, well, we need another hour. So I just finished teaching Goethe's Sorrows of Young Werther. I actually visited Frankfurt, where Goethe wrote this book exactly 250 years ago this month. The Sorrows of Young Werther was the first blockbuster in human history. Goethe was only 24 when he wrote it, and it catapulted him to international stardom. Fast forward to 1812. Byron publishes Cantos 1 and 2 of his Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. These 2 books created the kind of brooding, morally ambiguous, introspective, closed on their emotional turmoil characters that you will see reverberating throughout the 19th century. So if you look at the Byronic character, this sophisticated, intellectually astute, brooding, unable to accept reality that surrounds him, even though he exists in this reality, these characters will appear in so many books. Most importantly, it's Onegin in Pushkin's Eugene Onegin. It's Pechorin in The Hero of Our Time. It's a character like the Count of Monte Cristo in the Dumas novel. In English literature, you see this character in Rochester, in Jane Eyre. You see him in Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights. And this moral alienation of a human being who lives in a world but cannot accept the premises of this world, it is such an incredibly modern phenomenon. And it was birthed not in the 21st century, not in the 20th century, but it was birthed in the 18th century. It all starts with the French Revolution of 1789. So to understand modernity, I always send my students all the way to 1789 to see what happened then. How is Napoleon related to what happens in the aftermath of the French Revolution? And if I just may go back to my slides, I have a couple of images that I want to show you. Of course, Zapиски из Подполья, Notes from Underground, was first published in Mikhail's journal Время, Time. No, sorry, Epoch, the second journal, Epocha. But this is the separate edition that came out 2 years later. And look at the name right here. Stilovsky was the publisher of this. And his name is associated with Dostoevsky's Gambler. And the story is remarkable. I will tell you the story if we have time at the very end. Kafka, his Metamorphoses, was inspired by Notes from Underground, but also Ralph Ellison's The Invisible Man, a wonderful novel, a disturbing novel about the alienation of a Black American man in the urban environment. So very, very influential novel in the American cultural context. This is a Turkish adaptation of Notes from Underground. I have not seen this film yet, but I'm looking forward to seeing it this summer before I start teaching Notes from Underground on Substack. I've seen this film before, Notes from Underground. It's a fairly accurate rendition of the novel set in an American office environment. Once again, quite disturbing and very accurate. This is, of course, the most famous adaptation of Notes from Underground. It's a Martin Scorsese film with Robert De Niro, Sybil Shepherd, and Jodie Foster. Super controversial. Nominated for 4 Oscars. It won first prize at the Cannes Film Festival. And Jodie Foster plays a 12-year-old prostitute in this film. It is super violent. It's sort of a neo-noir film about a taxi driver played by Robert De Niro, who is a Vietnam War veteran, and he is having absolute, he is incapable of living in a world that is as alienating as New York City is to him in the aftermath of his service in Vietnam. He's suffering from insomnia. That's why he takes the night shifts and drives around New York City that is crime-ridden. And eventually, in this feverish mind of his, he decides that he is going to focus on being a vigilante who rids New York City of crime. If you sort of think that this is a very Batman-like plot, it's absolutely true. Batman was birthed out of the horrors of World War II. And so these vigilante superhero characters like Superman, Batman, and even Wonder Woman appeared during World War II out of the violence of that time period. So the connections are absolutely there, but it doesn't just go to Notes from Underground. It goes further back into these characters created by Goethe and by Byron, who are hyper modern, focused on themselves, rejecting sort of the rationalizing, progressive impetus of the world that was birthed by the 18th century, by the century of rationalism, by the century of Enlightenment thinking. And Dostoevsky debunks all of that in Notes from Underground, because he talks about rational self-interest as this philosophical concept birthed by the 18th century in France, and also utilitarianism, which was birthed by English philosophers such as Jeremy Bentham. And Dostoevsky says that people don't act in their rational self-interest. People reject utility because there's something that is raging inside our soul that cannot be quantified. There's something essential to human beings that is not possible to rationalize. And once we start pushing human beings into rationalizing formulas, we end up with catastrophes. Dostoevsky will say that 2 times 2 equals 4. Sorry, 2 times 2 equals 4 is a charming little thing. But if we're going to start praising everything, 2 times 2 equals 5 is quite as charming as well. It stands across your path, arms akimbo, and spits. And then he says, we don't want to turn into a piano key. That is the rationalizing, the utilitarian impetus of the world to make everything so standardized and formulaic. And Dostoevsky says a human being will never become a piano key, because we don't want to want according to a formula. And this formulaic scheme of modernity is being ripped apart by the scream of the human soul that in the process of self-realization convinces the world that it cannot exist without the margins of a formula. And Martin Scorsese's film is absolute brilliant, very brutal, and very violent masterpiece that talks about this. It has a very unusual, very American ending. So I recommend that you watch this. Word of warning, it's a very violent film. But the ending can be interpreted as a sort of dream sequence that doesn't really happen. So you will have to be the judge on that. So thank you. Russian literature and elsewhere. Okay. Found that students empathize with Dostoevsky more complex characters or hold them at arm's length. Well, wonderful question. Thank you. So do my students empathize with the complex characters of Dostoevsky, or just sort of push back? I loved reading their comments on, they had to write a paper on their first reaction to Notes from Underground. And some of the comments were, I'm not a psychopath, but I love this book. And I just laughed so hard at all of these student reflections, because this is what happens when students read Dostoevsky. I often get an email at midnight from a student saying, Anna, I'm at the library and I'm reading Demons and it's so depressing, but I'm laughing so hard. Am I okay? And I have to respond to them, congratulations, you're human. Well done. It took reading a bunch of novels by Dostoevsky to confirm to you that you are human to the core of your being. What students love about Dostoevsky is, one, how young his characters are. They love Tolstoy and Dostoevsky for that reason, that these authors write about characters who are their age. Same with Pushkin, same with Lermontov, same with Turgenev. I mean, Arkady, Pechorin, Arkady Kirsanov, Pechorin, characters like Ippolit Terentiev in the Idiot, and all of those lovely revolutionary kids and demons. Even Alyosha Karamazov and Kolinka Krasotkin in Brothers Karamazov, they're all very young, they're teenagers. And so students relate to writers who write honestly about the concerns of human beings of that age. And Dostoevsky writes about this age without condescension. Because you have to admit that when you're a teenager and when you're in your early 20s, people disapprove of you because you're not 50, you're not 60, you don't make the decisions of a 50 or 60-year-old. And that can be quite annoying for people who are older and wiser and who make much more weighty decisions in a much more processed way. Uh, Dostoevsky does not judge us for making decisions of teenagers and 20 somethings, and that is revelatory to students. But also, Dostoevsky is incredibly honest about who we are. So when you read Notes from Underground, and the underground man basically invites himself to a party and then makes an idiot of himself. And, you can read Notes from Underground and say, no, 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 no. That is so undignified. I would never do that. But then at some point you have to confess to yourself, actually, I did that. I was mortified by doing that. I knew in the process of doing it that this is mortifying, but yet I couldn't stop myself. And that is the beauty of reading a book like Notes from Underground, where you're first completely repulsed and I mean, the scientific term is disgusted by it. And then eventually you realize this book is appealing to you at the same time as you are mortified by it, precisely because it is so honest about character traits that we do not want to highlight, we do not want to discuss, we do not want to emphasize, and we end up being enlightened by it. Reading the sufferings of a human soul that are so honest is helpful to us because it helps us open up about all of those things that are constantly churning and churning and churning in our souls, that even our closest friends may not be able to relate or empathize. Students often tell me, and this happens with War and Peace more often than not. Students say, I'm a 21st century person living in the middle of the United States. I come from a small town in Iowa. Why do I find Russian aristocrats of the early 18th, relatable? And it's because Tolstoy is being so honest about what it means to be a teenager, what it means to be a young person in his or her 20s, trying to figure out every single day how to live. I often hear people say, well, we live in unprecedented times. And I always say every single day of every single person's life has been unprecedented. We wake up in the morning and we know what we're going to do. And yet going through this process necessitates us making endless amount of decisions. And many of those decisions are not going to be rational. And they're completely emotive, and we catch ourselves on rationalizing our rational decisions. So this is another thing that Dostoevsky does in Notes from Underground, where he says, yes, we love suffering, we have consciousness, and our consciousness is this mechanism that forces us to focus on our suffering. And sometimes we love suffering ever so much more than we love our well-being. At the same time, we make decisions that are not conducive towards our happiness. We make decisions that make us suffer, actually, but we rationalize them with our mind, which overrules our decision-making process. And this complexity of a human being, this screaming, yelling mess of incomprehensible contradictions, is our daily existence. And Dostoevsky, better than any other writer, revealed to us that this complexity is the best thing about us, that human free will is a gift that allows us not only to act well, if we choose, but also misbehave while conceptualizing what it means for us to be granted this ability to choose. And this contradiction of humanity, this ability to choose, yet choosing badly, more often than not, will not be resolved in Dostoevsky's novels till the last page of Brothers Karamazov. And I always tell my students, if you just read the last page of Brothers Karamazov right now, you will shrug your shoulders and you will say, what? That's it? But if you work your way through all of Dostoevsky, and that's what I intend to do in the course of the next 5 years, I have a 5-year plan. So we start with Eugene Onegin, Hero of Our Time, and Fathers and Sons this spring. Then next fall, we'll read Notes from Underground, celebrating the 160th anniversary of publication, and Crime and Punishment as a development of all of the themes and characters in Notes from Underground. And then in the fall of 25, we'll read The Idiot. Then in the fall of 26, we'll read Demons. In the spring of 27, we'll read The Adolescent. And then fall of 27, we'll read Brothers Karamazov. So in the course of the next 4 years, we will read all of the great Dostoevsky novels. And I will always begin the reading of a post-Siberia, post-Notes from Underground novel with a novel or with a work that was published earlier. So before we read The Idiot, we will read White Nights, and all this commentary will appear on my Substack page. So that's about all I wanted to say. Since the images are still up, I'm just going to show the rest of the images. So there's Robert De Niro and Jodie Foster and Taxi Driver. And you can see Robert De Niro pointing his finger as a gun at the screen. And then the most disturbing image of the film, where he has his mohawk cut and he is off to spread justice in this world. A terrifying scene is coming up after this. So yes, we can end the slide show now. And any other questions? I think I addressed all of the questions that were sent to me. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes. Any other questions? If not, it has been delightful revealing my thoughts on Dostoevsky to you. And please join me on Substack. I just started commenting on Eugene Onegin. We are getting to the end of chapter 1. There are 8 chapters in Eugene Onegin, and I'm commenting stanza by stanza. And then I will comment on all of the Dostoevsky novels in the course of the next 4 years. So please join us, and hope to talk to you in the future. Thank you so much. Bye.